Welcome back, everyone. And I hope you had the time for lunch and were able to look at the video. This afternoon's session is basically two parts. The first is a more detailed look around issues of ICH in the UK and addressing some of the issues that we've been discussed in the morning. And the second part, after a short comfort break, is some breakout groups where we'll be digging deeper into the practicalities of the convention and its relationship to ICH in the UK. So it's been a really fascinating morning, and keep up the really interesting questions and debates that's been happening in the chat. And I'll hand over to Clara for the rest of the day. Thank you.
They've been very interesting to listen to our colleagues in Europe, and three things that for me came through for this breakout, this moderated group to take account of. One is we are a bigger population, almost 70 million, and we are super diverse population, and that is important to bear in mind. And we are going through major issues. I mean, not everybody is going through, but we have a knack to go through it even more dynamically. Decolonization is one key area that we have been grappling with the Black Lives Matter that has become into sharper focus. So we need to take that into account, but that is not the only issue, but there are other issues as well. National minorities, language, and should language be part of ICH? At the minute, the convention says it's a vehicle to transmit. And then we have, I think those are the three things that I thought we should be taking into account when we discuss in this group, and then later on in the breakout groups as well. So to kick off to the panel, Paul, we all know, I'm not going to introduce them, their biography. It's in the program, you have it. So there's Paul Mullen, Daniel Carpenter, Hadley Swain, Michael Macmillan, Kath Budai, and Mairead McNicrath, who are going to be contributing to this session. I've deliberately made it, the state level. That's what the 3-4 countries have said, how the state dealt with it. Now we are coming down to the local level. This is not a state level response we're going to get from here. We are going to get people who have been with the communities, working with the ICH communities, as well as in different professions in the cultural sector, academia, practitioners, and a variety of background. So it will be interesting to hear the 6 people's view on what's happening at the ground level and how do we take this forward. We also need to be mindful of, I've been mindful in terms of representation. We've got Scotland, Wales. No, we're missing Wales, they couldn't make it. So we've got Scotland, Northern Ireland, and English regions represented here, as well as people who are bringing other minority background and perspectives to it. So we are a very mixed bag of people sitting there waiting to go through this exercise. So to kick off, can I ask about the current mood with the nation in this country? To what extent do the various communities you represent and work with, including various civil society, arts and heritage professionals, and the wider society in the English regions and devolved nations, identify with the 2003 convention? And would they and the UK as a whole benefit from the ratification? If so, how? So there are 3 parts to that question. First, do people identify with the 2003 convention? And would they and the UK as a whole benefit from the ratification? If yes, how? Can I kick off with Mairead? I see you right in front of me.
Okay, I think first of all, I'm speaking from a Scottish perspective, and I think people in Scotland identify very strongly with the ICH Convention. One issue, I think, is the language of the convention. People are still only becoming aware of the language of the convention. And as an example, I was at a conference in 2008 organised by Museums Galleries Scotland, and somebody said afterwards, I've been doing ICH all my life and I never knew it. So I think there's a gradual awareness of ICH. I would like to say just a word about universities, seeing as I'm a university academic, and I think there are a lot of heritage courses in universities, but most of the ones with heritage in their title are actually doing tangible heritage and issues of archaeology and conservation. There are a lot of university courses which don't have heritage in their title, but are actually doing what constitute intangible cultural heritage. But it's very disparate in terms of folklore, musicology, ethnology, etc. I have been trying in various ways to bring more of intangible cultural heritage into university agendas. And for example, I've done a lot about crafts with my students for the last few years, and they are always surprised at their lack of knowledge of what is going on in these sectors and haven't had the opportunity to think about possibilities for themselves in these sectors. And I think in a small way that if the ICH Convention were ratified, it would be easier to persuade universities to engage more with the concept and courses, but also with the practitioners, because I think there's a whole opportunity being lost at the moment of a disconnect between universities and practitioners.
Thank you. I would like to go to Paul now, as we're taking the nations. Paul, any similarities, differences in your response?
I must say, I mean, while certainly in Northern Ireland, there is a lot of engagement with intangible cultural heritage. Do people see it as an intangible cultural heritage is perhaps the question. I don't think there is a great awareness of what it is and what it stands for. Having said that, there is an awful lot of engagement with it. Certainly both Queen's and the University of Ulster as well, through sort of various courses and various individuals, will do their best to bring that out. But its understanding isn't widespread. Having said that, there's an awful lot of intangible heritage that does go on, and you know, some of it which is very fascinating, and some of it which is highly problematic. And maybe we might come to some of the political aspects of it,
the challenges
and the challenges at a later point. But you know, if we're trying to focus in terms of the awareness, I mean, I do know both the director of Built Heritage here and myself have written a piece on Northern Ireland for ICOMOS's February sort of newsletter, and we touch a little bit on intangible sort of heritage in that, and some of the dilemmas that it throws up, particularly whenever it abuts against the tangible. As such, you know, government departments, therefore, they work towards what is in legislation as opposed to what isn't legislated for, and that can, you know, create certain tensions there. But you know, I mean, I think there would be an interest in it, and I think there are certain, particularly, you know, local museums in particular, I think really in the Northern Ireland context could do a tremendous amount, and probably already do a tremendous amount of work in this area, but without knowing what it's putting a name to it in terms of the communities. And also the final point I would make, the Heritage Fund, we fund a lot of community-based heritage, much of which is intangible, so you've got bits and pieces around there that probably doesn't add up to a whole picture.
Good, but it's happening on the ground.
Yeah.
Exactly. You know, they don't call it intangible culture, but it is happening on a day-to-day basis. Can I go to Kath in the regions? Kath, what's happening in the northeast?
Hi there. So yeah, there is a lot of intangible cultural heritage. I think I'm going to say that whether people know it as that or perceive it as that or use that term is another thing altogether. I think that what you said about when you started, Clara, about people relate to it because they do it, is right, but they don't see that terminology perhaps as part of their everyday kind of doing and making and presencing their heritages. Just on, so there's a spectrum, I would say. There's a spectrum in terms of unknown, it's unknown, to it's probably a good thing, and everything in between, I would say. Do they identify with, so I'll go back to current mood among the various communities, cultural constituents. So yeah, there's a spectrum, I would say. People would do it anyway. Do they identify with a convention? I'm not sure. I haven't directly worked with the convention or UNESCO, but actually just hearing about presentations this morning, it's very dense. There's a lot to take in. Communities that I work with now, they are very much, there's that infrastructure necessarily isn't there, that time, that resources isn't there. I think we have to also take in the context of the pandemic, so post 2020. Prior to that Me Too movement, during the pandemic, BLM and George Floyd, and also COP26, climate change. You know, how is that all interweaving, not separately, how is that all interweaving in terms of the pressures on communities, the pressures on governments, and the pressures on the cultural sector, as it were. I do think, yeah.
I'm going to go to Daniel and then Hedley and then Michael coming that way. Daniel.
Thanks, Clara. I think, as others have said, I think we're starting from a very low base level in terms of the understanding of what ICH is nationally, and that goes across practitioners of all the domains. And that's very, very true for traditional craftsmanship. We've been going as an organisation, Heritage Craft, since 2009, and early on we identified with the idea of intangible cultural heritage and very much positioned ourselves within it. And that's gone through all of our work, including the Red List of Endangered Crafts, which we first published in 2017 as the first research report of its kind to rank traditional craft skills by the likelihood that they would survive the next generation. And as a result of that work, then a lot of our craftspeople do very much identify with intangible cultural heritage and have begun to see themselves as representative of ICH and ICH as a home for them, because previously they didn't feel that they had a home within public policy. They weren't necessarily artists, they weren't necessarily heritage practitioners, and there was nobody there to represent them. But this idea of ICH bringing lots of strands of different practices together under the idea of living traditions, it's very much seen as a home for them. So yes, everyone we've spoken to through our membership, through our research, has welcomed the idea of being seen as ICH practitioners. In terms of the benefits, I think very much it's largely a symbolic move. It would be to ratify the convention. It seems, being one of only very few countries not to have done so, it seems that the UK has kind of gone out of its way to avoid being part of this international community. And I think that reflects on practitioners, that they feel as the longer this goes on, us being left out in the cold internationally, the more it's a rejection of their status as ICH practitioners. I think it's awareness raising, which is a large part of our research. So this is awareness raising, it's also inventorying. I think raising awareness with the public, but also with funders and policy makers, and rebalancing the balance between ICH and tangible heritage. I think it's something that goes to the core of our public policy. I think, and then we'll come on to listings later, I expect, but I think maybe that's not so important, as we've seen with the speaker from
the question is, are they identifying it with themselves with the convention? and what benefits we will get from ratification. Headley, you've done Arts Council, you've done museums, you're coming with two different perspectives there.
Yeah, and thanks for a great day. I think, to echo what we've heard from colleagues, I think none of us would have expect people on the street to recognise this without it being explained to them. I'm still really surprised how many people I come to within our sectors who aren't familiar with the convention or aren't even familiar with ICH. Since we began talking about this more, I often try that little trick on them, and use ICH, and I'm still surprised how many people who are actually doing this, and we all agree, we're all doing it, aren't familiar with the term, aren't familiar with the language, aren't familiar with the convention, and it's a piece of ICH in its own right. Why Britain, it isn't keyed in the way it should be. Interestingly, I'm just beginning to hear a few groups begin to use the language as a methodology for empowerment, which I think is interesting. And I think that's something state bodies need to be aware of, that if they're not careful, they'll be bounced by groups who use it. And I think that's really interesting. I think it's also, in terms of to answer your direct question, what benefits? Internationalism, globalism, solidarity are all great reasons why we should be involved. And yet, even if, as you say those things, your heart slightly sinks because of where the UK is at the moment. So you would have thought at the very moment when you think it'd be huge value to be ratifying and not be in this small club that aren't members, you can see lots and lots of reasons why the current government would be shrinking away from it. But that's maybe a challenge for us as we continue the conversation. Okay,
Michael.
Thank you.
You're a practitioner. You've been an academic.
Yeah, I am both a practitioner. I mean, I've been thinking about the question of the ratification, and just picking up on Headley, I would go even further. I mean, I think at best the government pays lip service, at worst they're not interested. And it reflects really the cultural politics of heritage at the moment, and the question of whose heritage is being represented. The talk of culture wars at the moment, gets to the heart of what we're talking about. There's a kind of regression. We're in a space of, this is at a government level. I mean, I kind of give an example as a practitioner. I have, for instance, an installation at the front room, which is permanently now at the Museum of the Home, permanently. I don't know any other kind of work, color of black work that's permanent, which is saying we are not a temporary thing that happens every October. We are part of British society, period. And so these are the kind of fundamental kind of questions I think is important to think about. An example of the kind of contestation for me with government and cultural institutions, the whole issue of kind of returning artifacts to countries such as the Benin bronzes, right? Certain universities have gone against the government and returning some of them, are creating their own negotiations. And I think maybe that's the situation we're in. Regardless of what government do, we have to kind of find ways as institutions to find our own come together, in a sense, in terms of solidarity. I also think in terms of, many people who practice in terms of heritage, or this term, intangible cultural heritage, which is not talked about, which is not discussed in the public domain. So it's, it's a bit of a misnomer of exactly what it is. But in a sense, like who are part of that, who are making the decisions? I wanted to pick up a point about, Mairead talked about universities and practitioners, and the increasing corporatization of higher education means that there's a lack of connection with communities of practice. And so, it's also about power and who holds the reins of power in terms of the production of knowledge.
Thank you. Marie, I'm going to move on quickly, but is your response going to be lengthy?
No. I just want to draw attention to a recent report which came out in Scotland called Mapping Intangible Cultural Heritage Assets and Collections in Scotland, which really explains how intangible cultural heritage works in Scotland, and was compiled by Steve Byrne, and I think everyone should have a copy.
Thank you. Basically, you're saying the language is impenetrable. People are doing it anyway on the ground, and it is part of their living. You know, do we want to box it into intangible culture? If we box it, who boxes it? And what's the benefit? Because we're going to be part of the global scene. We're going to be at the table. We're going to be conversing. But having said that, we also need to factor into that picture how culture is being treated. You know, culture wars. There are so many things going on at the minute. We are in a flux, in a state of flux. How do we capture all of that and then let intangible cultures exist alongside all of the other things going on? Paul, you've got your hand up. What?
If it's appropriate,
yeah.
I sit on the Irish Government's Advisory Panel on Intangible Heritage, and they adopted the kind of the UNESCO Charter back in 2015, and have had three particular aspects of intangible heritage sort of listed on the worldwide list, and about 30 odd different practices sort of listed locally. I mean, it's very much seen as a positive thing by the Irish government, and it's a way of engaging and working communities. So, you know, I think where the politics works positively and can be used to shape things positively, you'll get that agreement and you'll get it to work okay. But you know, in a Northern Ireland context, certain aspects of intangible heritage, you know, would have the highly political overtones, and that you know, things like bonfires, which are seen as deeply sectarian, and so forth, but very much part of a particular tradition. So the more you would open it up to sort of government view, you're getting into that rather difficult territory. And just talking a little bit earlier, just as this was going on, you know, she flagged up the whole you know, idea of peatlands and the traditions of local communities in terms of taking peat. How does that fit? You know, where does equality and human rights in relation to all of that at a time of climate change?
Oh, absolutely, absolutely. The way of living, you know, and climate change and all of those other things come into play. But look, that brings me on nicely to the next question about barriers to ratification. It's a complex thing, and you know, some governments have hesitated for a while because of the complexity, you know, the contentious nature of it. How do you, you know, if you're going to list, how do you prioritize? You know, they're doing it already for the World Heritage sites, but how do you apply that kind of principle of listing? Is it a beauty competition? Whose heritage is superior and whose heritage is inferior, better in quality? All of those kinds of contentious issues come into play. So are there barriers? Is that why the government has not ratified? Has the government been presented with a complex situation, you know, language, whether it's Cornish language or Welsh language, you know, do we regard that as intangible culture, even though the convention says, you know, it's a vehicle for transmission? Do you think these kinds of issues have played a part? So what other barriers do you think? Why haven't we ratified? 16 years. For 16 years, we've been sitting, not even thinking about it. And every time there's been a question in Parliament, they've always cited Heritage Lottery Fund is doing a lot of work in that regard. So can I go to Hedley?
Thanks, Clara. I think you've got the culture of this country. We took ages to sign up to the Hague Convention. We have a conservative government whose very nature is not to do this sort of thing. And then people have already talked about the other very particular circumstances at the moment. I also think we have this slightly unfortunate situation where ICH almost falls exactly in the middle of a kind of Venn diagram for the key heritage cultural organizations in this country that would be the ones that championed it. So you've got Historic England, the National Heritage Lottery Fund and Arts Council, and you could argue ICH falls dead in the middle of those three, and therefore it's difficult to see the three would need to come together. And I think, you know, colleagues around the table would agree that although they're doing much better at that, historically they haven't worked well together. They've ploughed their own furrow. So I see that as a big problem. I have to say, and it was fascinating seeing the comparison with World Heritage Sites and ICH. I don't think World Heritage Sites have done us a favour here. I'm sitting, as I speak to you now, in the Royal Pavilion in Brighton, which is imminently qualifiable as a World Heritage Site, and our Board of Trustees don't want to touch it with a barge pole because of the incredible complexity involved in that process. And I think even though we've talked about the differences, it is recognised as being, you know, a complicated minefield. So I think there is a big cultural thing about Britain, its place in the world and its involvement in these sorts of things. A very practical thing about the way our state organisations are set up. That's without even doing the UK one. So it's a sort of three-dimensional complexity. And maybe a bit of sort of background noise. And I guess, you know, what we'll address sometime this afternoon is that really fundamentally, what does this solve? What does this make easier as opposed to what does it make more complicated? And I'm not sure at the moment we've articulated how ratification would make life easier for these, you know, beleaguered and the complicated world we live in at the moment.
Thank you. Michael, does that answer some of your questions?
Well, I'm just reading the
chat line. It's buzzing. I can't keep up.
Yeah, I'm just reading a notice from the question that was asked about ratification, and the key point in there was that it is not seen has any compelling business case. I think that is quite indicative. It's almost a red herring, really, as to whether it has a business. In a sense, I'm picking up Hedley's point about the purpose or function of ratification. There's a wider need for a debate in society about cultural heritage and whose heritage and how is that represented, who gets to decide, what is the hierarchy of heritage. And I'm seeing heritage here as something dynamic. There's a tendency to see heritage as calcified, you know, as tradition. It's always dynamic, it's always moving. And so I suspect in a sense the powers that be are afraid to have that discussion, because it then means we're then opening up, you know, how British society is being transformed.
Okay, thank you. Mairead, do you see, you know, I mean, Scotland is gung-ho about it. They've even got the First Minister has signed a letter or something similar to saying that you're ready to ratify, and the central government hasn't, you know, gone that far. So why do you think that is?
I'm going to be slightly more, twist that question slightly and say, how can we motivate them? Which is answering the two in one. And I think, first of all, one of the reasons that the government gave earlier this year was that they hadn't a proper business case. But actually, I think it's nonsense, but it actually can be answered, because the cost of being part of the ICH convention is not that big, and the financial benefits could actually be worked out. So a business case could be done. It would not be top of my priority list. I think there's a lack of confidence in some parts of the Conservative Party in English intangible heritage. I know that Laura Jane Smith 10 years ago said that she interviewed an official who said that there was no intangible heritage in England, which is why they didn't need to sign the convention. And I think to broaden their understanding and give, for example, the likes of cricket as an example of intangible cultural heritage might make it more appealing. I think also, while the current British government tends to be more isolationist, for want of a better word, the Commonwealth is very dear to it, actually. And I think an argument made about respect for the members of the Commonwealth who have actually ratified the convention, I think, would go a certain distance to persuade them. I mean, ultimately, I think it's a lack of knowledge. It's fear of inventoring, it's fear of politicization, and it's also an idea, well, we can do it anyway. Why do we need the convention? We're already doing all this stuff. So it's answering those arguments.
Okay, that's useful. That's very to the point, and the politics of non-ratification. Daniel, your organization has been involved in lobbying the government quite a bit with the heritage crafts. What do you think?
Yeah, so we've asked the government many times on why they haven't ratified, and we've been given the same answers over and over again, that they're not minded, it isn't a priority. The latest breakthrough we had, which Mairead referenced, was the call about 2 years ago for a business case, which again we think is a bit of a red herring. Tangible heritage assets don't have to justify that they'll financially wipe their own faces in order to justify their existence. So we've just been left to speculate on what the reasons are. I think it's very deep rooted within British culture. I think there's a colonial legacy to it. I think we've got museums built on acquired artifacts, some legitimate, many not so. Stately homes built on the wealth generated through colonialism. And this is what we define as our national heritage. I think another factor is we don't have an easily defined indigenous population. We have a multitude of populations within our country, unlike Norway and Sweden, which have a very well-defined Sami community that we've heard about this morning, with a particular voice and a call to be represented. I think as an island nation, I think we're very wary of international collaboration, and we've seen that represented through Brexit, which I think is reflected an underlying feeling amongst the population, but also driven it as well, which I think is continuing. I think within England in particular, there's a level of embarrassment about traditions. If you ask somebody what an English tradition is, they refer to Morris dancing or cheese rolling, but in a very derogative sense. But all the things I mentioned, I think, are rooted within social class, and the fact that there's a cultural elite gatekeeping and defining what is cultural heritage in this country, very much related to, Mairead mentioned Laura Jane Smith, her idea of an authorised heritage discourse. I think it's to do with cultural gatekeepers. How we break through that, I think a lot of this is reliant on personalities within government. I think if we can find a minister or an influential civil servant who can embrace this idea and maybe think of it as their own legacy within government. I think with Nadine Dorris, the current Culture Secretary, she's very focused on levelling up. I think there's an opportunity for us within that, in that ICH is often comes from working class communities. So if we can kind of flip that narrative that I've described about the elitism and the cultural gatekeepers, and look at this as a way for the government to fulfil its own obligations and manifesto pledges, I think that might be a way. I think the economic case, again, it's probably a bit of a red herring. But I think maybe benchmarking against other countries like we've done this morning, it would be a great way to show government how it could work for us.
All right, that's a very long list and a very comprehensive analysis. Paul, what do you think? You've got other problems as well to factor into this.
Well, for those who know the history of Northern Ireland, we had a Good Friday Agreement in 1998, and we went from sort of actual wars into the next stage, which were cultural wars. So we've been engaging in this space for some considerable period of time. What I would say is that I don't think we should be frightened by that necessarily. The more we understand our past, the more we understand our traditions. Actually, we create a much more plural space. And it's a call to that degree of plurality. I quite like what Daniel was talking about in terms of the levelling up agenda and whatever. There is something very, very unelitist. The Laura Jane Smith stuff moving towards, a more inclusive heritage discourse has to be seen as a very good and positive thing. That doesn't mean to say it's not going to be difficult. I mean, back to my example of in Northern Ireland context of the Orange Order, which many people would argue were set up under sectarian principles and would still be quite sectarian, yet they're one of the best manifestations of what intangible cultural heritage is in the context of anywhere, and who would I be to argue against them being kind of, listed or whatever. But it just brings out the complexity and the challenge of the problem.
Yeah. Okay, we've got all the political issues, political problems, and how culture fits into the political framework. A big issue for the government. And somebody said about respect for the Commonwealth. I'm a colonial child. From the Commonwealth. We have loads of people from Commonwealth living in this country. And the fact is that these cultures are mixing so much. We talk about intangible culture, English culture, Welsh culture. They are mixing so much that we are not even taking note of it. One of the projects we did in Peterborough Museum project was, how choral singing and the singing Muslim women singing confuse and work together. So we need to be mindful. We are not a nation that is pure white and English, and we are not separated. We are confused, complex, and mixed. So these are some of the things that we need to bear in mind. Kath, I must come to you. Your Northeast region, that is a very mixed, confused, complex region. They might shoot me for that. Yes.
Yes, Clara, it's mixed, confused, complex, muted, but it's also, I think, because of recent happenings, context. I think context is also important. Context is important, not just globally, but locally. And I think when we talk about barriers or even intangible cultural heritage, we have to think about the local, the region, and the global, because as you say, all of us, we are here, but we are also there. And all of our ethnicities, if you go back in time, we are not from a certain one space, basically. In terms of, I just want to kind of twist this a bit as well, because I feel like a lot of things have been said that I was going to say anyway, but actually, just going back to Headley, and he mentioned the Venn diagram space. I'm thinking about a kind of space as well in terms of barriers. So, but also in terms of the future, if this is not going to happen, if the government is not going to go for ratification, how do we think about what next? And how do we prepare for different scenarios? So the scenario of the government not going for ratification, that's scenario one, let's say, or the second one, or the second scenario, the one in which what do we do? What do we do if they don't? Do we bypass the government? Do we work directly with communities? At the end of the day, I think we need resources. We have a lot of issues in terms of kind of institutional and systemic barriers that we're facing that actually kind of like comes down from the government. I think that culture, the government has a stronger hold on cultural institutions, whereby whether it's funders, museums, all that sort of thing. I just think that it is a very complex problem, and I can't say I know what the next step is, basically.
Yes,
you know?
basically, I mean, your question is it's important. You know, what do we do? Do we go and do our own thing?
Yes.
And who will lead on that, or do
Yeah.
we need somebody to lead on that, or can we do it locally?
Yes.
As we've gone on? But we've also got the other bit. You know, how do we get representation globally? How do we work with other countries? How do we become a player? How do we learn from exchange ideas and those sort of things as well? All right, let's I mean, it is given us a lot of information and food for thought. We are speculating because we don't know. We haven't been given any kind of feedback from the government other than business case. So we have to speculate. We can only second guess what might be the reasons based on our personal experiences and community experiences. Let's move on. Okay, we've listened to the models this morning, different approaches to ratification. And if the government decides tomorrow, yeah, we will, we will go down the road of ratification and sign up to the convention. Which of the models that you listened to this morning would suit us, or maybe a hybrid, or none? Something else that you might think would be more appropriate for us. I will start with Kath. You are sitting there. I think I will start with you. You said community model. Is that the way you want to go? Earlier on, somebody, Headley pointed out in the last session, it's a big burden of the community. We are putting a big burden on the community. So what model do you think we should go for if we had the choice?
I think it has to be a model whereby there are bottom-up approaches, but obviously
it is a bottom-up convention, so that is a given.
Yeah.
So the community decides which one it wants to protect and save. So, of the 3-4 models this morning, is there something that?
Okay, I'm going to cherry pick a few things. There is something around the Commonwealth Kingdom model. I'm not sure to what extent the government at the moment is going to go for that. There was a sense that I felt like when Harry and Meghan got married, there was a sense that they were extending to the Commonwealth, and that would have kind of helped things along. But obviously, we know what happened there. So that was quite interesting, that model, but also have to think about the sensitivities around that. There is something around the Dutch model, again, about the new cultural participation fund. So whatever you do, you make sure that resources are devolved into all the organizations that are the stakeholders, the actors, okay? There is something around, which I didn't hear too much about, communities. I know you say it's bottom up, but it's actually where the community is sitting, who is sitting where, how are they, at what level can they make decisions, for example? I think process is important. It has to be a step-by-step process. It's not something, even working from the framework that was that ICOMOS brought about in 2018 with the museums, perhaps revisiting that framework, Clara, as well. I think obviously the sort of interdisciplinary model, working with different organizations, funders, museums, cultural partners, blah, blah. I think, so this is like I'm cherry picking because I'm thinking for the UK, this could be the sort of hybrid, you pick different things basically, but
you want a hybrid model, mix
model. But actually, I think methodology, I think someone here mentioned about methodology and approaches. And we have so many good examples of how things have worked in terms of the cultural sector, in terms of governments and the cultural sector. We need more critical methodology. We need something a bit more deeper, something that's a bit more different to suit the context that we're in, basically.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right. Now, Daniel, what do you think? Which model would suit? You've been at this, for a long time. Which model would suit us?
I've been really fascinated to hear the speakers this morning, especially hearing from the Dutch, the fact that they were very critical about ratifying the convention. I think from an external perspective, it's easy for us to kind of look at everybody within the convention thinking that it's logical to them and it was no problem getting it through their own countries. I think if we can recognize the fact that they've all had difficulties in getting it through, then we can learn from that process. Interesting to hear that a number of countries have been working on a register for good safeguarding practices. I can only speak from within traditional craftsmanship, and we've been very focused on inventorying. And in terms of safeguarding practices, we've launched a grant fund of small grants to help individual practitioners overcome obstacles that is preventing them from continuing their practices. But we're very much learning as we go, and there will be learning from that process that could feed into something that could eventually be a register for good safeguarding practices. But maybe that's something collectively we could work on and make a focus. I like the Swedish expert nodes model. I think that could be something that could be really good, to have an organization for each of the domains, and that would kind of mobilize organization like us for traditional craftsmanship and give us some status within that. I was interested to see the difference between Sweden and Norway in how much they're focusing on listings and the representative list. For Sweden, it seems it's not such a focus, whereas Norway seemed to have focused on it a lot more. I think that might help us in a way to avoid too much focus on the lists. In the question that you circulated, Clara, you talked about super diversity and the fact that Britain is a super diverse culture. I think that's right. I think until we have a robust selection process, and any selections for listings will be very difficult. It's going to have a political element, and there's going to be communities that feel left out, whatever we choose to put forward for a listing. So I think, yeah, maybe we don't focus on listings to begin with. We just focus on awareness raising, inventorying, and creating means for good practice in safeguarding.
Thank you. Just for the audience benefit, the question was, you've heard about the governance responsibilities and potential challenges relating to the convention from the morning speakers and the 4 different countries. Which of, if any of the models would suit the UK? What type of ratification would you recommend for a nation like the UK, which celebrates a unique super diversity status in Europe and globally? And I do go around Europe, I meet with lots of people. We do have a unique situation. We do have also a complex situation. So it is not very easy to just pick and mix and do things. You have to think through very carefully. Michael, do any of those models fit your views?
Yes and no, I suppose.
You're making it even more complex.
I'm sorry, I am very hopeful.
Right.
I hope I'm not giving the impression that being pessimistic, but I am also
no, not at all.
I'm taking kind of Daniel's point and Kath's point about social class. This is a class-based society, and Kath points about working the way up from the bottom up. I mean, I think that's got to be the principle in a sense. But I always think of communities and in the plural, yes, and there are different types of communities. And there are lots of community organizations. There are lots of agents of change, because in a sense, artists and cultural practitioners are trying to work out through their work these ideas of identity and the confusion. They're working through that process anyway. I also think small is beautiful. So I think starting small somewhere, would help. There are a lot of cultural institutions who do share, who are fellow travelers, who share similar kind of approaches. So I think it's kind of going with those who come together and speak together in kind of solidarity. Maybe I'm hoping I'm not sounding so naive, because here I haven't even mentioned the government. But I think it's kind of just going ahead and doing what we need to do anyway, regardless, because ratification or not, in a sense, there needs to be a wider kind of engagement with what is being shifted around cultural heritage in this country. And this idea of tradition, what does that mean exactly? You know, what is that? It's continually changing, it's continually dynamic. The other thing is recognizing how Europe, how we're perceived, we're part of Europe, but we're also part of the Atlantic, you know, and the diaspora. And so it's the local, but it's also the global. You know, I am a diaspora subject. I'm a kind of post-colonial subject here, but I have a kind of transnational connection. So it's always the local and the global. One has got to think about in that sense. Yeah. Malta kind of recognized its own geopolitics. I like that. They recognize their geopolitics. I would have thought the Netherlands would have more recognized their own colonial history, but maybe that's asking a bit too much. I don't know, because having worked in the Netherlands, there is a similarity here. There are similarities in terms of, dare I say, a multicultural society that's shifting and changing. And what does it mean to be Dutch now, in a sense? What is Dutch cultural heritage? I'm thinking of Zwarte Piet. Now, you're familiar with Zwarte Piet?
No, I'm not. Oh, yes.
The blackface, the blackface, the blackface, which could be, someone could say, this is part of our cultural heritage, our intangible cultural heritage. Let's put it on, well, let's actually talk about how that continues to offend people, you know, who have settled in the Netherlands even to this day. So I think these are the kind of challenges, in a sense. And I think Kath made a very important point about critical methodology. What are the methods that are being deployed here to engage with practitioners and communities of practice around cultural heritage, intangible cultural heritages?
Okay, thank you. I'm coming to two people here who, I mean, we talked about if there's no ratification, let's do our own thing. And you both, Hadley, you've worked with a funding agency. Paul, you are part of a funding agency. How could those agencies, I mean, you know, Heritage Lottery Fund has spent what, 7-8 billion already. Hadley Arts Council probably has similar amount, and you know, spent similar amount. How do you think they could facilitate this?
I mean, I think we already do. I mean, our definition of heritage really is, you know, those aspects of the past which people want to remember for the future. So we, at the heart of everything we do, are people and communities, and particularly through not that long ago, we had our landscape partnership schemes. There were just so many aspects of intangible heritage that were supported during all of those schemes. So, you know, I think we do quite a bit in that regard, but I'm not sure we would be the right organization to necessarily go into the kind of the management of UK-wide type approach to it all. Yeah. You know, just listening to what people were saying sort of earlier about the benefits of what had been said this morning, you know, I mean, I think, you know, what you would come up with in Northern Ireland would be quite different to what you come up with in Scotland, would be different to Wales, would be different to England. So in some respects, for DCMS to come up with something all embracing for all, you know, is already, would be, you know, extremely challenging, because the needs are just are so different. That's probably not very positive, but it's just because I don't know what the clear solution necessarily would be.
Okay, and do you have a preferred model?
Oh, I mean, again, I can go back to my involvement in the South of Ireland's engagement in this, and you know, very much letting the communities identify what's important to them. There is an advisory group which I'm on. It's kind of an expert voice, and sometimes the battle within that group is trying to remind everybody around the table that they are privileged and expert, and that, you know, what is honestly being presented by local communities, really we should we should be listening to them sometimes more than our own voices. But broadly, that's quite a light touch group, and the Irish government see intangible heritage as something which, and this probably would equate more to what maybe Scotland would want to do, as something that they are extremely proud of. But I think there's a real opportunity in all of this. If there were principles and values which were based around inclusivity and recognizing that we live in a plural world, that what could emerge out of engagement in this debate could be very, very interesting.
Good. Hedley, I'm not asking HLF or Arts Council to manage it, but they have got the finances. How could they facilitate it?
So thanks for. I mean, Arts Council paid my salary for a long time, and I'm a huge fan. And I think they've got the sort of weight and heft and intellectual and strategic heft to take something like this on. But as you know, they've just published a 10-year strategy that doesn't mention ICH in any, you couldn't find it anywhere in it. It's not part of their historic or future look. So it would be a big shift. And going back to what I said earlier, there is this uncomfortable intersection with other organizations. So I think it's tricky, but I think I would love to see, as I said, Historic England, National Heritage Lottery Fund and Arts Council sit down around the table and say, actually, is this an incredible opportunity for us to work far better together, which is what we all want them to do. In terms of the models that we had, all 4 fascinating talks, but as you said at the beginning, the scale, recognizing the scale is very, very different. I think the Dutch model, we've got a lot to learn from that. The one phrase I picked up that, I think it came from Sweden, was lift, not list. And that really resonated. And I do think I would love us to ratify, but I wouldn't go anywhere near a list, because it is so complex here. But the idea of initially using ratification to just raise the profile of ICH, I think would be very powerful. Other than that, I do know Scandinavia incredibly well, and ICH is so embedded there. It just feels different.
Yeah.
What I also loved about Sweden, I don't know if other people noticed, they've got Semla on the list. Semla is basically a sticky bun. So basically any country that formally recognizes a sticky bun as part of their cultural heritage gets my vote. I'm sure we could all come up
and
with
toffee
good
pudding. Mairead, I'll come back to you, Kath, but Mairead, I mean, Scotland is ready. Which model would you think suit? Do you think?
I mean, the first thing is that given that it would be a UK application, it would be a UK model. That's the practical. But I think the key is in the question. You talked about the unique and super diverse state of Britain, and I think the model would be unique to Britain. I think it would be a model which would respect the devolved nature of the UK. So how the different partners in the UK would work would need to be worked out. I think it would be a model that would respect diversity. So how the different minorities in the UK belong to that model would need to be worked out. I think it would be a model that would respect the domains of the convention. I mean, we had an inventory in Scotland, or we have one, a wiki, but it's not laid out according to the domains of ICH. And I think it would be good to follow those domains from the beginning. I think it would be a model which connects with communities, but also as individuals. And one of the ideas in the recent report from Scotland was citizen task workers. So individuals as gatherers or as experts of intangible cultural heritage, as well as organizations and groups. I think it would be a model that recognizes the expertise that is already here. I mean, there's a huge expertise in different aspects of ICH throughout all parts of the UK. And finally, may I say, a model that's perhaps not London-centric.
We're not London-centric today. We've been,
no.
That's why we spread it out to the whole country.
Yes.
We can't be London-centric.
So your kind of model.
Okay, that's good. Kath, is that something about pressing, burning issue.
Quickly, yes, burning. I think we need a sustainable model. I know we've heard this word over and over again, but I think just picking up from the point on plural societies, I just want to kind of note this whole concept of pluriversality, which the Colombian American anthropologist Arturo Escobar has cited. It's about the ways of being attuned to justice and to future practices, not extractive and all those things, not colonizing, but actually, working with the new colonialisms we're all part of course. I think that his model, pluriversality, will address great societal challenges. It will move to, I don't want to mention the word toolkit, because probably there are many toolkits, okay? It's a model that's based on not just about who we are, but when we are. It's important to think about the past. We are in the present, but we have to locate, where we're going and how we prepare for the future, which is all this is part of. It's all about decolonizing approaches, I think. And I think someone in the panel here mentioned that, super diversity, I would say pluriversality, Clara, and also to say that we have to create through ICH a world where many worlds fit.
Very nice phrase, a world where many other worlds fit.
Yeah, many worlds fit, yeah.
Many worlds fit. That's a nice ring to finish on. Can I ask, the other questions was, if we ratify, intangible culture is going to sit along tangible culture on the same continuum. Do you see any problems with that? Is there going to be lots of difficulties? Marie, you're nodding your head there.
Yes.
Can you kick off?
I think there will be a fear of division of resources or dilution of resources. I've come across this already, where resources are already limited. So there may be a fear from people engaged in tangible heritage that resources which were previously for intangible heritage will now be diverted to intangible heritage. And I know that's a false separation, but I think that fear is there and needs to be addressed.
Michael Macmillan.
I think that's a really valid point, really, given all we've talked about, the kind of representation of kind of cultural heritage. The question of, I'm kind of conscious of how at the moment diversity is kind of merely a symbolic gestures, really. Differences that make no difference. And I want to kind of just include inclusivity, because inclusivity is about, I'm not just sitting at the table, my voice is being heard, and I'm taking note of that. So it's actually making diversity a bit more active, proactive in a sense. But the issues that I think Mareida talked about, the kind of differentiation between in the hierarchy, in a sense, of intangible and intangible cultural heritage is something to be aware of. But it's a wider issue about hierarchies, in a sense, what is seen as quote unquote cultural heritage. If we just take away for a moment intangible and tangible, what is defined as cultural heritage anyway?
Okay, right. I'd like to go across here. Daniel, do you see a lot of difficulties when the tangible and intangible sit on the same line?
Yeah, I was going to say what Mairead said, really. I think there is a fear about kind of dilution of resources within the tangible heritage sector. And I don't know to what extent any kind of a museum's lobby may have fed into the resistance to ratify the convention so far. Don't know whether that's been a factor. It quite possibly may have. Yeah, there was something else I was going to say, building on what Michael said, but I can't remember what it was now.
Not to worry, we'll come back to you on that. Paul, you deal with this on a daily basis, tangible, intangible,
yeah,
and criteria, all of that. Yeah,
I mean, certainly from our perspective, I don't think it would bring about any change in our kind of financial splits. I mean, intangible heritage does not cost the same that big buildings do, and we fund many of the projects that come to us that are looking to do sort of interesting things. Intangible heritage, if anything, actually is much more closely tied to communities, and good intangible projects, I would go as far to say, nearly always will be funded by the likes of ourselves. I think there is a slightly different issue that kind of emerges, and that is, where sometimes the intangible can crash into the built heritage by way of different legislation kind of at play, and because legislation it will be for very much focused on architectural value, or a monument, say, that is listed and so forth. The intangible element that's crashing in won't necessarily be respected as much. But the more that heritage as a whole engages with communities, listens to communities, works to communities, I think the more opportunities emerge anyway. What governments, I don't see, if it was ratified, I can't necessarily see it leading to a great change in how, let's say, the government of Northern Ireland will fund the heritage that it does. What it might do is help local museums, for example, to engage much more with their communities. But it's an extension of that community engagement that I think is the real opportunity through having this discussion.
Okay, I do take the point, but community engagement, what is a good community intangible cultural heritage project, are all value-based and personal judgment, and those are some of the things that often get in the way, but that is for another day. But I take your point about there shouldn't be difficulty, but providing that we have a kind of agreement that they're both of equal value. At the minute, that is not the case. Hedley?
Yeah, no, I don't see that there should be a conflict or problem between tangible and intangible. And as we've said, if we get it right, they complement each other. As we've kind of said, our tangible heritage and everything built around it has come from a very traditional, imperialistic, very traditional model of heritage, whereas intangible does come from another direction, and that for me is a very healthy thing. I do think right now, Michael has kind of prodded this ant's nest, and we have to recognise right here, right now, this is such a complicated area, and that's why I think we have to be very alive to that, the politics with both big and small p, and be absolutely honest that in terms of resources, we can't kid anyone that there's going to be more resources for this right now, and therefore we have to frame it in the sense of it helps us use the resources we've got better. I think that's important. If I might just throw in, one of the really interesting things for me today that I hadn't really thought about enough before is this idea of empire and commonwealth and intangible cultural heritage that is commonwealth. And I guess Satnam Segera's programs and books at the moment maybe bring this even more to the forefront. But the idea, and Clara, there are people here, there are people from the Indian diaspora who've taken intangible cultural heritage across 3 continents now, from India to Africa to England, and yet we're worried about what we're going to do at a micro scale in England. And therefore that idea, can we internationalize intangible cultural heritage, and might that be a particular model that would value the UK, is quite interesting to me.
Thank you.
But that might just be too much for today.
We're 10 minutes over, which was right, because we were lagging behind by 10 minutes. At this point, I'd like to, Kath, you have responded, haven't you, on that? Oh, carry on.
I just want to follow up on Hedley, really. and the Indian diaspora. I mean, my research is on preservation of Indian diasporic cultures, but actually Indo-Trinidadian. So this is like once removed from India and also twice removed in Canada. And it is around preservation and conservation. But actually, how they do it, Headley, it is different and it is nuanced and it's absorbing. And actually, one of the things that we haven't really pressed upon here is the generational, not generational gap, but a generational shift that's happening, you know, right here, right now, that we really have to encompass in this whole debate that we're having, really. And I think that, yes, having a more nuanced approach, figuring out what works for us here, but there are many things that needs to work for many communities. I will just pick up on the community thing as well that Michael was talking about. It's not just about, yes, communities aren't homogeneous, but actually we have to think about how identities are shifting and changing as part of this whole debate. And that shifting and changing has to do with a form of intersectionality where people are not being defined just by a one identity singular mode, but actually multiple identities across the protected characteristics, for example, but also transnationally, diasporic. It's you know, it's some of the challenges that come to play.
Okay, thank you. At this point, you know, the 6 panelists have given their views and they've raised quite serious issues for the workshop to consider and the breakout groups to consider. The breakout groups are going to be focusing and Joe Buchanan would give instructions for the breakout group. But if there is any clarification from the audience, not question, just clarification, please ask now. Otherwise, you won't get a chance. You will go into your breakout group soon, after the tea break. There's a lot in the chat, and people have read it. Please take those comments and not questions, a lot of comments in the box. Please take that with you to the breakout group and use it in the discussion. So at this point, if there aren't any questions, I can't see any questions coming through. Is there a strategy for engaging with the government? That's a good question. Crossing borders is interesting. Using those to buy is another thing altogether. But do we have a strategy to engage with the government? We have the government representation here of the devolved government as well as central government. ICOMOS will have a dialogue with them after this. That is the arrangement, certainly with DCMS, and I can't see why not with the devolved government as well. So we will have a dialogue with them after this, and we are also hoping to create a kind of outcomes from this to send it to the government. This is what happened at our roundtable. So that will help. But a proper formulated strategy, no, I don't know of one. We all have been talking to the government independently as organizations or as individuals. There isn't a formulated strategy. I don't know if the devolved governments have got a formulated strategy of talking to the government, central government. Do you, Paul and Mairead?
Yes, I know that we have a cross-border or cross-party culture committee in Scotland, which has been in contact with the Westminster government about signing the convention on many occasions. Okay,
and Paul, Northern Ireland.
All I'm aware of is the contacts that would happen between the likes of the Built Heritage Directorate and the various other directors in the countries and England, and their engagement also with DCMS from time to time.
Okay, thank you. So there we have it. So, you know, certainly we will be writing on the basis of the outcomes of this roundtable. I hope you all worked hard at getting to some conclusions and recommendations for way forward. Can we ask Group 1 to go first in terms of reporting back what actions were agreed recommendations came out of it?
Yes.
Give us a flavor of the discussion as well. It'd be good.
I think overall everyone wanted to ratify, but no one feels very positive that it'll happen, is probably the best thing. But also, there was a lot of conversation about how that would look and a need to make sure it was devolved, not only to the different countries, but to the but then again locally, to make sure it really was a bottom-up approach. I'm trying to, I mean, that was, you know, a lot of people looked at it as a tool possibly for an awareness raising, for advocacy for ICH. But also, you know, they went back and forth on whether or not it would actually help practitioners or if it would just be more of a hindrance. Because, and someone mentioned that even though they ratified for the World Heritage Convention, there's no money. They don't, you know, there's no support for World Heritage sites. So why would there be support for intangible cultural heritage? So, yeah, I think, you know, people want it to happen and they would love to hold the government's feet to the fire, so to speak, but they're not optimistic.
So they want to ratify, but not sure that it will happen. But in the meantime, raise awareness.
Yeah, I mean, that's
was there any recommendation for ICOMOS?
There's lots of recommendations. I've got 4 pages of notes.
Can you throw out a couple?
One of them was they were interested in ICOMOS facilitating a platform for best practice. There was a lot of good. They were glad that we did this in the first place and to allow this platform and for us to come together, and that they want to do ongoing dialogues and talk about how regularly we should actually do this and meet. They also talked about the need to push best practice in their own sectors and to also carry on with mapping and inventory and communicating with government. Yeah.
Okay. Does anyone want to seek clarification or ask any question of Brandy?
Yeah, that's a real generalization of what happened.
Could I mention that the resource issue was quite strong in the group, that ratification with resources, that ratification without resources really was placing an impossible burden on communities. And we also talked about making the business case and whether or not one could and should make a business case for ICH. And another theme was education, that perhaps looking at ICH in the school program might be quite useful, and bringing in museums as part of the strategic way forward.
And agricultural was mentioned.
Agriculture, did you say?
Yeah, was another. Economy, agricultural, education, and museums were probably the 4 biggest mentioned.
Economy, education, and museum, the 4 key sectors. Yeah, okay, thank you for that. Okay, can we go to group 2, please?
Thank you, Clara. So we did get through all the questions. So starting with the first one, exploration of creating the list. Yes, there were sort of mixed views on the list in terms of how to make it fully representative, how to ensure that, you know, all voices were heard, who manages those sorts of things, who's the gatekeeper. But at the same time, you know, felt that just because it might be difficult, it shouldn't stop us doing that. It shouldn't be the first barrier, give up there. Certainly, I think our phrase of the day is lift, not list. We did love that, really loved that. And so looking at that, you know, how the important thing is raising awareness about ICH, making it more understood, making it more accessible to the general public, what it is, what's involved, etc. Ensuring that, as all communities, and we don't mean those geographically, as was said this morning, including those that currently sort of work under the radar, how would they fit into any sites of inventory and how to create. And we were fortunate to have Hildegunn in our group from Norway, and was giving us the example again of how they worked with the Sami people, and so actually didn't go with their sort of traditional listing, worked out a better way, which also gave them an opportunity to think about how to engage with other communities in Norway, other minority communities in Norway, and not just go with the sort of, this is a list and this is how we do it. So being inventive with your inventories. Looking at the impact of not ratifying. We did all agree that obviously so much of this activity happens anyway, regardless of the fact, and will continue to happen, as happened for, generations and so forth. But what not ratifying would end up is it reduces the focus and therefore lack of priority. Example was sort of from Scotland about support at the moment from the Scottish government, but ratification would help sort of push that up the agenda. It gives the recognition of the value of intangible cultural heritage. We talked within that about the need for sort of structural changes in order to allow this, shifting the mindset of organisations, particularly sort of, NGOs, local, national government, even universities, but also funding and resources that will be needed to, both get these developments and so forth off the ground, but most importantly, sustain them. And also that there could be, as was touched on earlier in the panel discussion, about potentially slightly differing models for each nation within the UK, recognising that a sort of different position that each of the nations are in at this moment in time. The model, very much that how do you get the national conversation, how do you ensure that it is wide-ranging, and then once you've got that, in a sense, it's using that conversation with as wider-ranging voices as possible to decide then what the next step is, for example, how best to create those inventories, those lists, and how to make those valuable. Yes, I think I probably muddled up actually the model with the not signing up, so apologies for that. The way forward and the recommendations, yeah, that was a bit more tricky. We had a suggestion from Norway about whether organisations in the UK apply for accreditation, so that then they can work with UNESCO under the in cultural heritage and cultural tangible, I can't even say it now, intangible cultural heritage, and maybe that's a starting point, rather than just sort of waiting or trying to get government to actually ratify. And potentially needing, and this could be, ICOMOS, how does somebody facilitate those conversations with, or broker conversations with, the NGOs, the universities, and whoever, in order to really start moving things forward. And as I say, whether that's the ICOMOS ICH committee, with obviously now the backing of all the people that have been in this this conference today, was felt definitely that it is a moment in time to push government, perhaps on that sort of agenda of political appropriation of folk customs being quite prevalent, and how do we stop that being a negative thing, and that might be a sort of point of discussion or way into discussion with government. So I think those were my notes. Please chip in, group 2, if I've missed anything crucial or misrepresented something. Marvellous, obviously did it perfectly. Thank you.
Very good, very comprehensive, yes. Okay, that's group 2. Anybody wants clarification, seek clarification of Katie? No, okay. Right, can we move to Michael? Where are you?
Yeah, so a lot of the things that were discussed in the first 2 groups was also discussed in our group. I think the overwhelming thing that came through was right at the beginning already when we started on this thing was that ratification was really important, and that was actually need to be done before anything else could be done. That was really important, and the importance of ratification actually for advocacy, and importantly also through with the listing for safeguarding, especially in for some forms which are at danger of disappearing. So that, you know, it's really urgent at the moment, I think. So so for endangered practice, for example. But there's also the danger, and I think it was said before, of listing of not being inclusive. So the thing of exclusivity, because as one person pointed out, precisely those bearer communities that are actually most disadvantaged and whose existence is most precarious would least have access to any process of listing or advocacy. So that's really important. I think, again, right at the beginning, the whole matter of the peculiarity of Britain at the moment, the fact that we have devolution and that we have devolved governments, that's really important in whatever form we're going to do any sort of ratifications. I think that is something that came out, the whole thing of devolution, and also maybe that the processes actually look at how the reality of our political structures. We looked a little bit at the disadvantages for non-ratification, although we actually just sort of, we did it mostly ex negativo, and really it was really about the advantages of ratification. One is, again, for advocacy and for awareness, and again, the whole thing of lifting of the profile, the importance to counteract the isolationism, which we're experiencing a lot in the UK. And so in a lot of ways, ratification would be also symbolic. Important point was made and parallel with the biodiversity, that actually ratification would ensure that our cultural diversity and the cultural ecology is maintained and would be a bulwark against erosion. I think that's important. When we talked about the model, which is really very interesting, and my understanding from my notes and from the discussion was that we were talking less about a structure and more about a process and about a dynamic process. So the model would be something dynamic. So for example, the question about, could it needs to be flexible? Could it be reviewed? So it's something that was dynamic. It would be able then to address the whole thing of intergenerational exchange and intersectionality, for example. And the idea is that we then have to look at what I think somebody called the evolving political kaleidoscope, and then to have something that is reactive to that. And there's the whole point of any model or any process would be building on the ethics of ratification, and also addressing, again, the economic value. We looked at politicization and the danger of politicization and governmental control. There's a question of, in that, then one of the ways maybe to address it and to look at that whole, the context was to have, as part of our advocacy and our dialogue with government, is to have developed a model in advance, and this actually would then be able to, we talked about the Swedish model, for example, that seemed to be something that people thought would be really good, and that relates also back to devolution. When we looked at the next steps, I think that again, there's a talk about, you know, trying to move to ratification. The question Hedley, our chair, talked about the one way of dealing that is maybe an all-party parliamentary group, and also I think came up increasingly about the concept of a champion within the halls of power. There's danger of that, of course, because the fact is that it could be then blindized and taken over and abused. So we have to be very prepared for that. But I think also also the question is, should we be approaching it at devolved nation level? We realize, for example, that we've noted that Scotland is ready to do it. Wales, we're not quite certain, but that might be a way of, you know, approaching it from the devolved nations. There's the possibility of continuing, or the importance of continuing the conversation we've started today, and maybe having some sort of coalition with the Arts Council, for example, sitting around a table with some of its similar organizations, both within England and also across the devolved nations. I think that was it so far. I don't know if I missed out anything, please.
Anyone, Hedley or anyone else in the group to add to that? Okay, all right. Well, there's quite a lot that have come out. I mean, one thing that comes through very clearly is ratification. To continue this conversation, we need to ally ourselves with different groups with similar views and support for the convention to be ratified. Ratification comes first, or model comes first. You know, it's the ratification is first, and then we can tease out all the other problems and models, but have a model in the back pocket to offer, to show them what it looks like. The inclusivity is causing concern all around. You know, how do we make sure that is integrated and plays a central role, because our communities are changing so at great speed. So how do we make sure inclusive approaches are built into it and integrated it properly, and those people from those communities are represented at the table? Devolved government, you know, allying with devolved government who seem to be in favor of ratification, how we could work with them and forge partnership with them to do this. Politics, we need to be mindful, you know, it could go one way or another, but useful to have some kind of political support. I think those are the key points that have come up, which are good. What do we do next? We're hoping to, it is a lot of information that has come out today, and thank you so much for contributing to this process. We are hoping to write it all up, certainly summarize some of the key outcomes and key recommendations that have come up, and share it as a first step. And then we will produce a publication of the proceedings so that it has a fuller text and sets out clearly what went on today. We will try and continue with this work. One of the things I wanted to raise right at the outset today was, organization like ICOMOS are working with tiny budgets or no budgets at all. This roundtable, we had no budget at all, and all of the committee members had to put their time in free of charge. We cannot continue like that, and it's something that, you know, I worked in the funding sector, but it's something the funding agencies need to recognize. You know, some of the civil society organizations do work that are of public benefit. And just because it's a roundtable doesn't mean it doesn't benefit the public. It does. And how we factor that into the assessment and the criteria that funding agency do set out. I'm not being cheeky, maybe I am, but doesn't matter, but it has to be recognized. The work that has gone on into organizing this roundtable, you can ask the committee members sitting around you, enormous amount, huge amount has gone into it. And some people had to work harder. And I'm sure that is the case with other civil society organizations as well. What else can I say? But thank you so much for coming along, giving your time, contributing to this very, very important process. And we will make sure that the government hears what went on today.